about the Church of Rome from the book of Romans? Well, we learned that it had no apostolic founder. And that might come as a surprise to you because, of course, we associate the Church of Rome with Saints Peter and Paul, the twin heroes, the twin martyrs, the glory of the Church of Rome. Both of these men came to Rome and both of them died as martyrs in Rome. And many people kind of assume that they established the church at Rome. Usually they think that St. Peter did. But we know for certain that the Church of Rome has no apostolic founder. And we know this because of the way he addresses them at the end of the epistle in chapter 15, and also the fact that Paul is writing to the community and not to another apostle who was responsible for that community. Now think of what St. Paul himself had been through in Corinth and in Galatia. Remember that the biggest complaint or criticism of St. Paul was the fact that he called himself an apostle when most people believed that he did not qualify to be considered an apostle because he was not an eyewitness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There were hundreds of apostles, not just 12. The term was used much more widely in the early church, and an apostle was an eyewitness to the resurrection of Christ. So St. Paul did not qualify for that. And so his people would come to his areas, to the parishes which he established. We only know of two of them, the Corinthians and the Galatians, and they interfered with his ministry. We have a lot of order in the church. The church is always orderly. When a service is done in the church, it follows a specific order. We sing the hymns that are required for the day. We have the epistle readings, the gospel readings, whatever, the psalms, the prophecies, whatever are required for that day. The priest performs the liturgy in a specific fashion. He always wears the same kind of vestments. The church always has order, and it had from the time of the early church. There was a hierarchy. The 12 were at the top, then the apostles, and then Paul lists people like prophets and others. There was a kind of hierarchy within the church. There was an order within the church. So why am I telling you this? Because Paul was not regarded as an apostle by most Christians. They disregarded him as a leader of the communities which he established. So that's why the super apostles came to Corinth, and they pulled the Corinthians away from St. Paul's leadership. And the Judaizers came to Galatia and did the same thing. So St. Paul was very, very sensitive about this, about other people coming to his congregations and interfering with his work. Just as a bishop does not go to the diocese of another bishop and tell the people, the congregations in that diocese, what to do. We don't do that. In that order, taxi was established from the very beginning of the church. The same thing with an individual parish. If you have a parish in, New York City, the parish in Long Island the priest of a parish in Long Island does not go to New York City and tell the people there what to do. They have their own priests there. So every priest is responsible. The presbyter is responsible for his own congregation. The bishop is responsible for his own diocese or metropolis. That's how it works. If there was an apostle who was responsible for the Church of Rome, St. Paul would have at least mentioned him or directly written the epistle to that person. Now, there's another little hint, and it's toward the end of the epistle, and that's in chapter 15, when St. Paul says, "I do not wish to build on another man's foundation." This, he says, in connection with his desire to go to Spain. In other words, he says, I've looked around, I've done everything I can do in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, there were other apostles who were actively establishing communities in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and other parts of the Roman Empire, but nobody has gone to Spain. So he says, I do not wish to build on another man's foundation. Well, he certainly would not have interfered with the Church of Rome by asking them to help him in this missionary effort if there had been an apostolic founder who was responsible for that church. So this is one thing that we know. So if there is no apostolic founder, how did the church develop in Rome? How did the gospel come to Rome? Well, we can't say for certain, but clearly the message of Jesus Christ, crucified and risen from the dead, Jesus Christ as the Messiah, arrived in Rome somehow by people who had already accepted Christ, possibly in Jerusalem. I want to call to your attention the very famous passage that we have in the book of Acts, which describes what happened on Pentecost Sunday. Do you remember that? So some of you who might be epistle readers in church, this is a challenging reading if you don't practice. You have to practice, of course. So after the apostles, the people in the upper room, 120 or so members of the early church, receive the Holy Spirit in the form of tongues of fire, and they begin to speak different languages. They come outside, and it describes some of the Jews who were in Jerusalem at the time of Pentecost. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia. This is chapter 2 of Acts. Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God. So there it mentions visitors from Rome, Jewish visitors from Rome who had gone to worship at the temple, and proselytes, this is Jewish converts who had come to worship at the temple. Remember, the temple was the only Jewish temple in the entire world. So Jews came there from all over the place. And so among the people in the crowd who heard that first message at Pentecost, when St. Peter got up and began to speak, among the people who were listening to him preach were Jews from Rome. Did these people convert that very day? Did they accept Jesus Christ and be baptized that very day? Or was it at a later point? We really don't know. But somehow, remember, because they're not converting to another religion. These are not Jews who say, well, I'm converting to Christianity. I'm going to go back to Rome and tell everybody in the synagogue. They say, we've found the Messiah. We know who the Messiah is, and we believe in him as the Messiah and the Lord. And they went back to Rome with that information, and having learned all of the scriptures associated with Christ, how he fulfilled these various prophecies. When they returned to Rome, whether it was after Pentecost that very first year or at some later point, when they returned to Rome, they bring this knowledge and this belief with them, and they share it with their fellow Jews, because this is not a separate religion. So this is how the gospel went to Rome, and it appeared in very natural setting in the synagogue. Now, in the past, when we were talking about Corinth and the dating of Paul's epistles, I mentioned to you about the Edict of Claudius. So we know that the gospel was in Rome at least by the year 49, when the Roman Emperor Claudius issued his famous edict. And I told you how important this is, this date, for establishing in a general benchmarks for the dating of Paul's epistles and of Paul's activities. So just to remind you, the Edict of Claudius was an order that was issued by the Roman Emperor Claudius. He's the one right before Nero, after Caligula.